Gary Stevenson is a multimillionaire and former trader who wants to see higher taxes. Annabel Denham is from the Institute of Economic Affairs, the UK's free market think tank, and Rachel Kay is a researcher at the High Pay Centre, an independent, non-partisan think tank focused on the causes and consequences of economic inequality, with a particular interest in top pay. Annabel, well, welcome to you all, first of all. Annabel, can I start with you? Do you think anyone can ever be worth £48,000 an hour?
Well, I think we're worth what employers are willing to pay us, and that depends on us being able to provide services that consumers are willing to pay for. People like Denise Coates, they're paid like that because they're delivering the goods. And in fact, the British public are actually quite sympathetic to the idea that risk-taking entrepreneurs are paid or remunerated very highly. And I think a really important point to make here is that Denise Coates hasn't received high pay at the expense of others. Even if you don't approve of gambling, she's created an incredibly successful tech company in Stoke that's able to compete on a global level. And the money that she has earned reflects that. And I think too often we argue that, or make the case is made that in taxing those at the top, or taking money in some way, confiscating assets from those at the top, it'll somehow trickle down to those at the bottom. That simply isn't the case. Ultimately, the market for top talent and the market for low-skilled labour are simply separate markets, and you cannot help low earners with knee-jerk eat-the-rich policies.
How do you know that the British public are in favour of such massive remunerations?
Well, I mean, polling has kind of consistently shown that the public are not sympathetic to the argument that we should tax somebody like Denise Coates more. They do believe that some high salaries are justified and are broadly comfortable with entrepreneurs earning large amounts of money. What people do sometimes struggle with is the idea, or they're less happy with the idea that senior company employees are paid very well, because often people don't see the value. They don't necessarily notice that that individual is producing value, but that's not the case. I mean, just to go back to my original point, where people are paid what employers are willing to pay them, yes, and that is contingent on their skills and their talents.
Gary, you've probably earned £48,000 in an hour at some point in your career. How did you feel about it, or how do you feel about it?
I don't think I ever quite made it to £48,000 an hour. So look, I'm from a poor background, and I made money, and I know how important it is for people from poor backgrounds to be able to make money. So, Annabel said something really interesting there, which is about this is the market for top talent. Look, I've been in that market for top talent. I understand that market helps poor people make money. But let's look at what actually happened here, right? So Annabel Coates, she gets paid, Denise Coates, she gets paid £480 million. What was that market like? Okay, so who is the owner of the company? Well, that is actually Denise Coates. So Denise Coates owns the company. So when she looked around the market for who are the best CEOs, well, she picked. And then when she decided how much to offer herself to convince herself to take that job, she chose £480 million. So when we look at that, it doesn't really look to me like she's really taken the most talented person there, because she herself, she is the owner of the company. She owns the company. She decided to hire herself as CEO to pay herself £480 million. I don't think really this is a case of big companies picking the best talents. I think this is a case of very wealthy people from very, very wealthy families paying themselves as much as they want.
Yeah, I mean, and let's move away from Denise Coates, because she's merely an example, and one of the more recent ones that we've talked about, a new 31-year-old billionaire on the Forbes list today as well. I mean, Rachel, a new billionaire was created every 17 hours during the pandemic. Do you think that the wealth divide will continue to grow if governments don't tackle the issue in some way? I mean, I'm listening to Annabel and Gary's points, but it is escalating, is it not? And there has to come a point where perhaps that divide starts to shrink rather than expand.
Yeah, absolutely. is escalating. I wanted just to go back before I answer this question to the points raised by Annabel, because I think it's actually really important to address some of the ideas behind those. So I think it's fair to say that most people would accept that those who run successful businesses should be paid more than average. But there's a really important question of proportionality here. So it's obviously not proportional to how hard she's worked, because her pay award is about 15,000 times the median pay for a full-time worker in the UK. So it would be ridiculous to
Indeed, but leaving her salary aside, because, I think Gary's gone into it in detail, as has Annabel, just the idea that she's not the only person who's being paid, significantly more than, the vast majority of the population, 99% of the population, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good point, actually. I really don't think it's worth attacking individuals, because this is about a wider structural problem of how wealth is distributed within companies and within society more widely. So moving away from her, I think there's a commonly made argument that Annabel made, which is that it's fine for CEOs to be paid a huge amount because they're responsible for creating a huge amount of wealth. But that's a myth, firstly because wealth creation is collective, so CEOs rely on the workers who work for their companies. They rely on public spending on the education and healthcare systems that ensure that they have a skilled and educated workforce to draw on. And they also rely on transport infrastructure, for example, that moves their products around. And I'd say also it's a myth that the wealthy will create value by investing their wealth, and that therefore society benefits from wealthy people, because actually many of the capital gains made by the wealthy today are from extracting value rather than creating value. So the wealthy overwhelmingly put their money into unproductive and speculative investments, such as property, for example, which may generate high returns for them as the investor, but which don't expand the productive potential of the economy. And the same applies to how... Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, no, go ahead.
The same applies to how most business leaders are rewarded, because executive pay is increasingly tied to share price, or executives are rewarded with the option to buy shares, which means that CEOs have a very direct incentive to increase the share price. And this frequently results in quite strange practices such as share buybacks, where companies will use their profits to buy back their own shares and artificially inflate the share price and therefore their own salaries. So I'd actually say that the wealthy aren't necessarily creating value for the economy and for society, and often
Indeed,
actually is at the expense of others.
Thank you for that. Alouette has written in, has tweeted me, and I, as I say, I keep wanting to take it away from Denise Coates, who just happens to offer a very good example at the moment. But Alouette has tweeted me saying 80% personal income tax. Denise Coates brought in 380 million in taxes, didn't she? And Gary, there is that, and also the fact that doesn't get mentioned very often in reports of what Denise Coates earned, which is that the company also paid 85 million into her charitable foundation. So can we rely, when people get super rich and make a lot of money, can we rely on the tax that they pay and their philanthropy or their tendency toward philanthropy in order to level things out?
You know what, Mariella, I really, really wish that we could rely on the taxes that they paid. And I really wish that they all did pay their taxes. But unfortunately, if we look at the very wealthiest people in society, and then we look at how much taxes they paid, in the cases where we can see that, they often pay very, very low percentage of tax overall compared to their income, much less than you or I, or, often much less than lowly paid people such as cleaners or nurses. They end up paying very, very low rates of tax. Philanthropy is obviously fantastic. I say congratulations to everybody who's made enough money they can give money to philanthropy, to charity. But the fact is, if we try and rely on philanthropy to fix our broken economy rather than a fair tax system that works, it's simply not going to work. We'll see a continuation of what we've seen up till now, which is more and more money flowing to the richest, while ordinary, hard-working families can't afford to buy houses.
Annabel, that is the problem, isn't it? That the tax system doesn't really seem to be fair. It doesn't seem to level out. And it does seem that the super rich end up paying a fraction of what the rest of us pay out of our, monthly salaries or whatever. And that, in a way, is part of what fuels the discord and the resentment and the sense that it is entirely unequal.
Well, I mean, certainly our tax system requires fundamental change. It needs to be massively simplified. And at the moment, there are areas, yes, where it works for the super wealthy and where it does not work for those who are among the poorest in our society. So I absolutely would support the notion of tax reform. I think there are just a few interesting points made earlier in the discussion that I'd like to come back on. First, we talked a little bit about wealth inequality. Well, that has actually been pretty much constant for many decades. When it comes to income inequality, there was a sharp rise in the Gini coefficient in the 1980s because we moved towards an economy where we had winner-takes-all income distributions. We moved away from industries like manufacturing and towards things like finance and entertainment and leisure, where the turnover in top salaries is very high. However, since the early 1990s, we haven't seen an increase in income inequality. So that's quite a misleading narrative that is pushed into the public domain and is simply inaccurate. I'd also just come back on one of the points made earlier around this idea that CEOs have equity in the business and are therefore incentivized to raise the share price. I find it quite extraordinary that anybody would think that that was a bad thing. Surely we want our CEOs to have skin in the game and be invested in the success of the company that they are perhaps on the senior management team for or indeed running.
Rachel, do you agree about that disparity in terms of wealth gain? Do you agree that it hasn't been exacerbated in recent years? And do you want to respond to Annabel's point there about CEOs' incentivization in listed companies?
Yeah, well, CEO pay has gone up substantially since the 1980s.
But I mean, so is the cost of living. That doesn't really mean anything in real terms, does it?
Yes, it does. I mean, it's gone up a huge amount. Much more than the cost of living has gone up. You mean in percentage terms? Yes, yeah. And wealth inequality has also increased. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways of measuring this. Depending on how you measure it, you can come out with different conclusions. But the High Pay Centre looks at CEO compensation, and that's gone up hugely. So that will obviously have implications for the wealth of those individuals as well, because obviously when you earn more, you can therefore invest in assets and so on. And then on the point about...
Yeah.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
The point about incentives. So it hasn't always been the case that CEO pay and executive pay has been aligned with shareholders. And this is actually a development that happened around the 80s. And previous to that, the company was more seen as the purpose of the company was about increasing production and long-term investment. Whereas there are a range of different policy developments that led to the purpose of the company being more about short-term profit and purely about creating or primarily about creating value for shareholders. And
okay, let me put that to Gary. Gary, is that something that you agree has happened, that change since the 1980s?
Well, I think there's definitely be a change in the way that companies behave, and you can definitely see there's a lot of pressure to push up share prices. But I just want to mention just something quickly on whether wealth inequality has increased, because I think this is really, really important. You know, I'm a wealth inequality economist. I look at this every day. I talk to top global experts in this, such as Aaron Advani at Warwick University, Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley, and they say that there is no doubt that the share of wealth held by the super rich and the top 0.1% has massively increased. The reason that people sometimes say that it hasn't is because they're looking at data which is coming from surveys where they say, if you fill in this survey, we'll give you a £15 Amazon voucher. Now, I don't think you'll be surprised to find that the super rich tend not to fill in these surveys for a £15 Amazon voucher. So I just want to say, I'm talking to the top economists every day about whether wealth inequality is increasing. They're confident that it definitely is.
Annabel.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I don't think that we're necessarily going to see eye to eye there. I suppose I would just...
But surely this is a factual situation.
Well, I've read plenty of research from economists that suggests that the Gini coefficient hasn't changed
What is
in
the
the last
Gini
30 years.
coefficient? Well, what is the Gini coefficient?
Income and
Sorry.
wealth inequality haven't changed over the last 30 years, longer for wealth inequality. But, rather than squabbling over that, I suppose I would just pose another question to our other panelists, which is, let's say that income and wealth inequality, the chasm is widening on a fast scale from one year to the next. But let's also say that everybody is getting wealthier. So we're able to improve the living standards of the poorest in society, even if the top 0.001% are getting wealthier.
But that's the question, isn't it, Annabel? That's the question, isn't it? Is everyone,
question.
yes, but is everyone getting wealthier? I mean, I've just been talking to someone coming up with a new commission talking about food poverty in the UK with 5.9 million adults enduring food poverty and 1.7 million children. So actually, when you look at the figures, it doesn't suggest that society in general is getting richer. I mean, Gary, this is something that you sort of bet on, if I can put it like that. I mean, that's how you've made a lot of your money. It's quite incongruous in a way that you were so committed to levelling up and to fairness, and at the same time, your fortune has been in large been based on working out whose economies are going to collapse.
Yeah, look, I didn't come into this world wanting to be an inequality economist. I'm from East London. I come from a poor background. I wanted to make money. My job was to figure out when the economy would recover. The history of that is so fascinating because the economists predicted every single year since 2008 that we would recover next year. So I had to understand why the economists were always wrong. I came to the conclusion that it's because they don't understand the damaging effects of inequality on the economy. In my opinion, if we don't fix inequality, that will mean all of the money goes to the rich who use it to buy house prices, who use it to buy houses, pushing house prices up. None of it will go to the rest of us, and the economy will be weak. So for me, I think the economy won't improve.
How do we fix inequality? I mean, you're a former trader, now a multimillionaire, but you actually want to see higher taxes. So do you see higher taxes as the answer?
Yeah, I think definitely higher taxes have to be part of the solution. But it's really important to emphasize when I talk about this, those taxes shouldn't be on ordinary working people. This story about Denise Coates is a perfect example of how things work. Her father was a multimillionaire when she was a teenager with a betting empire. Now she's a multimillionaire with a betting empire. Where I'm from in Ilford, people have houses only if their parents had houses, So we're in a situation where you can only be rich if your parents are rich. But we need to go after those super, super rich families rather than just making changes to the tax system that are going to end up hitting ordinary working people. So for me, it needs to be taxes, but it needs to be on the super rich.
But of course, and Annabel, I'm sure, will agree with this, whenever, extremely high rates of tax have been introduced, then an awful lot of the super rich, whether we like it or not, have moved to other tax domains, haven't they? So Annabel, is it I don't know, is it about incentivizing people? Is it about a reformed tax system that means that you can't just, I mean, I know that there has already been a lot of work done in terms of sort of closing down those kind of tax loopholes and tax havens. But, what are the answers to make it fairer, forgetting the disparity and how great it is?
Yeah, I mean, and just to go to my previous point, I think that the point I was making is just that we can fixate on high pay, and it distracts from the very important issues of low pay.
Well, that's why I'm saying let's not talk.
I wasn't dismissing that. Yeah. So no, to
let's not talk about that. Then.
As you say, we know that the wealthy are very sensitive to tax rises, and we know that if you increase income tax, for instance, then it can lead to lower revenues for the Treasury. So it's something that you need to approach very carefully. I would rather not solely look at the cost of living crisis through the prism of government intervention. How can price controls or regulation or higher minimum wages address the cost of living crisis? I'd rather look at how government intervention actually raises the cost of living for a lot of people. Look at housing, look at childcare. There are areas that government regulation is driving up costs, and that is contributing to the cost of living crisis. And that is what I would like to address, rather than having this rather simplistic approach of let's just tax wealthy people more, as though that won't have an impact on people's behaviours and potentially, hit those perhaps in the middle, hit those at the lower end of the income scale, rather than hitting the billionaires.
Isn't it about cultural change as well, though? Because you need people to want to pay taxes, because actually we all benefit from taxes being paid and the country actually being, operating well as a result of the fact that we pay tax. You can't enjoy having dustbin men and roads fixed and all of those things if you don't pay your fair share of tax. And that does seem to be a particular issue in this country. But Rachel, £8.92 is the latest level for the minimum wage. According to the High Pay Centre, over half of Britons support the introduction of a maximum wage, and £100,000 cap would hurt less than 3% of earners. I mean, what do you think about a wage cap? I'm sure that Annabel's going to be vehemently opposed to it, but what are your thoughts? Is it even workable?
Yeah, so the piece of research we did about that wasn't about fleshing out a concrete policy proposal, but it was actually rather about demonstrating just how much potential there is for redistribution in the UK in terms of raising the pay of lowest earners. So I think I'd want to think much more carefully about it as a policy proposal before saying definitively yes or no. But I think the main point actually here is that just having a wage cap, or just, as Annabel said, thinking about taxing the rich, is kind of skirting around a larger problem that workers are really disempowered and have become more disempowered over the last few decades. So trade union power has rapidly declined, and basically the majority of workers don't have much of a say in how their company is run and in the decisions that affect their daily lives. And there's plenty of research showing that high levels of trade union influence are connected to fairer wages and also better working conditions. So I'd say where we actually need to start with this is to think about how can workers have more power in terms of determining their own working lives. So, I mean, they invest their labour and their minds and their bodies, so it makes total sense that they would actually be involved in those decisions. So
okay, we're running out of time, I'm afraid, very fast. So I want to ask all of you, just very, very briefly, if you had a magic wand, what would be the very first thing that you would do in order to try and make things a bit more equitable? Gary?
I think for me, the wealth tax, which is being spoken about, that is the key. That is the one that's going to fix it for us. And if we could have that uniformly across Europe and in the US, I think that would do a massive amount to improve economic life for ordinary people.
But that is a dream, and that is a magic wand instance, isn't it? Do you not think that wealthy people just move off to Monaco or wherever?
Well, I mean, if you look at the 60s, where we had high tax on the rich all across Europe, there was nowhere they could go. Every country has this problem. Every country has the same problem of the wealthy taking way too much and leaving not enough for the rest of us. So we need to work together to fix it, and then they can't run away.
Annabel?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of companies that have introduced wealth taxes have later abandoned them, which is a pretty strong indicator that they don't work. I think that, we have nearly 5 million people still on the furlough scheme. When it is unwound, unfortunately, a lot of those people are not going to have jobs to return to. That might be in hospitality or retail or the other sectors that have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic.
Sorry, we're just coming up to the news, Annabel. Yeah.
Oh.
Go on.
I see.
Very briefly.
We need to have a flexible labour market. We need to try and deregulate the employment and make it as easy as possible for companies to take on workers as we emerge from this crisis.
Thank you very much. And Rachel, just finally, a brief word. I mean, you've talked about trade unions and empowering workers.
Yeah, exactly. Redistributing power within the company. There are various ways of doing that, mandating worker representation on boards, more democratic forms of company ownership, and expanding trade union rights.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Gary Stevenson, Annabel Denham and Rachel Kay, thank you for joining me here at Times Radio. This is Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio.
At the moment, these guys are profiting from a crisis that is going to keep our economy in the stump for 50 years. There is one other thing they can do with that massive amount of income. They can buy your mum's house.